The dawn was still young as Cedric and Vorganax began their journey toward Drakmor, a wild and untamed region on the edge of Lysoria. With the medallion hanging around his neck, the knight felt a strange connection to the dragon flying high above him. He soared through the skies like a living storm, his massive wings cutting through the clouds with grace and power. Cedric rode his horse below, his eyes often glancing skyward, marveling at the sight. After a few hours of silence, Cedric's curiosity got the better of him. As the dragon swooped down to glide closer to the ground, he called up to him.
"Vorganax,"
he shouted, his voice carrying in the wind.
"tell me of the old times, when dragons filled the skies. What was it like back then?"
The dragon let out a deep rumble, part sigh, part growl. He flew lower still, matching Cedric's pace as they moved along the rocky path. His massive head turned to face the knight, eyes gleaming with memories long buried.
"Oh, of the good old days,"
he began, his voice a deep, resonant growl that carried both pride and sorrow.
"There was once a time when dragons ruled the skies, and the lands below trembled at the sound of our wings. We were many, spread across the mountains, forests, and deserts of this world, free to fly wherever we pleased, from the highest peaks to the deepest valleys."
Cedric listened in awe, imagining the skies filled with these majestic, powerful creatures.
"Were you at peace with humans then?"
"For a time, yes,"
Vorganax said, his voice lowering as though he were sifting through memories both bitter and sweet.
"There were those who revered us as gods, and others who sought to live alongside us in harmony. We were a force of nature, and humans respected us. But peace is fleeting, especially in a world filled with ambition and greed. Wars between kingdoms broke out, and with them came distrust, fear, and bloodshed."
The knight frowned, guiding his horse over a rough patch of road.
"What caused it? The war, I mean."
The dragon's eyes darkened as he remembered the devastation.
"Ambition, it always is. The kings and queens of the world grew hungry for power, seeking dominance over all lands. Some sought alliances with dragons, offering riches and favor in exchange for our strength in battle. But others..."
His voice grew grim.
"Others saw us as a threat to be eliminated. They hunted us and drove us into hiding. The war that followed was catastrophic. Dragons and men alike perished in numbers too great to count. Entire kingdoms were swallowed by fire and ash."
Cedric felt a chill crawl down his spine.
"And the dragons that survived? What happened to them?"
The dragon gave a long, low sigh.
"Those of us who survived fled to the far corners of the world, hiding where we could. Some took refuge in deep caves, others in remote islands or beneath ancient forests. Many of my kin vanished altogether, their fates unknown. We became myths, legends to be told around campfires. The once great dragon flight of old is now scattered and broken."
Cedric was silent for a moment, reflecting on the sheer scale of loss Vorganax had witnessed. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like, watching your kin fall one by one, the world changing forever.
"Is that why you've stayed in that cave for so long? To hide from the world?"
"In part,"
the dragon admitted.
"but also out of grief and loneliness. What use is a dragon with no kin, no skies to rule? The world no longer has a place for us, or so I thought. But I grow tired of hiding, and perhaps it's time to see if any of my kind still remain."
Cedric, emboldened by Vorganax's candor, asked,
So, where are we headed? What awaits us in Drakmor?
The dragon's head tilted slightly, his eyes focused on the horizon.
We go to visit an old friend, or rather, I hope to. His name is Thalorax, a dragon of the Silverclaw lineage. We fought alongside one another in the Great Wars, and afterward he retreated into a deep cave near a small town at the edge of Drakmor. I haven't heard from him in many years, but if anyone could have survived the passage of time, it's him.
Cedric's brows furrowed.
You think he's still alive?
I hope so.
The dragon said softly.
But the truth is, I cannot be sure. Thalorax was always more reclusive than most, even among dragons. If he is alive, he may know of others, or at the very least, help us in our journey. But if he's gone, then we shall press on alone.
Cedric nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him.
And if we find him, what then? Will he help us find the others?
Vorganax's eyes gleamed with a faint hope.
Perhaps Thalorax and I shared a bond forged in battle and blood. If he still lives, he may be willing to aid us. But we must be careful. He is not as forgiving as I. He may see your presence as a threat.
Cedric tightened his grip on the reins.
I will be careful. The answer to one question is, you have lived alone for so long. Why not stay that way?
The dragon's massive wings flared slightly as he glided closer to the ground, his voice quieter, almost thoughtful.
Because, Cedric, I have been alone for too long. Loneliness can be a terrible burden, even for one as old as me. You remind me of a time when there was hope in the world, when there was something worth fighting for. And perhaps through you, I can find that again.
The knight said nothing, but the dragon's words lingered in his mind. Vorganax was not the ruthless creature he had expected, but rather one burdened with loss and searching for purpose. And in that, he saw himself reflected. They continued on their way, the wind carrying them toward Drakmor, where an uncertain future awaited them. As Sir Cedric rode along the wide, rugged mountain road, the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the path. The road twisted through steep cliffs and dense forests, leaving him in a remote and unfamiliar region. The air was crisp, and the distant sound of a rushing river could be heard echoing off the mountainside. Suddenly, a group of figures emerged from the trees ahead, blocking the road. They were rough-looking men, their clothes worn and patched, with weapons loosely hanging at their sides, clearly bandits. There were 4 of them in total, their faces hardened from a life of hardship and violence. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward and raised his hand to stop Cedric.
Hold it right there,
the man said, his voice gruff and commanding.
Who are you, and what business do you have on this road?
The knight reined in his horse, keeping his face neutral, though his hand instinctively tightened around the hilt of his sword. He knew this was trouble, but he kept his composure.
I'm just a simple traveler,
he said, his tone calm.
I've been on the road for days, and I'm a bit lost. According to my map, there's supposed to be a city nearby. I was hoping to reach it before nightfall, maybe find a place to rest.
The bandit with the scar laughed, a harsh and mocking sound.
City? There's no city around here, traveler. You must be even more lost than you think.
He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing.
Best you turn around and head back the way you came. This road leads to nowhere you want to be.
Cedric feigned surprise, giving a respectful nod.
I see. If there's no city, then I must be mistaken. I'll turn around, then. No trouble from me.
The scarred man gestured with his hand dismissively.
Good. Now get going, before we decide you're worth more dead than alive.
Cedric gave a quick nod, gently pulling the reins of his horse as he turned back the way he came. He made a slow retreat down the road, keeping his pace steady. The bandits watched him go, their suspicion still heavy in the air. Once he had put some distance between himself and the group, he glanced upward, scanning the sky. High above, nearly invisible against the backdrop of the setting sun, he could just make out the shadowy form of Vorganax circling in the air.
What do you think?
The knight muttered quietly under his breath, hoping the medallion's connection would carry his words to the dragon. From above, Vorganax's deep voice rumbled into Cedric's mind.
There is a city, as you suspected. These people guard it, or rather keep out uninvited guests. Don't worry, there is another way.
He continued down the road until he was out of sight of the bandits, then turned off the main path as Vorganax directed. He guided his horse up a narrow trail that wound around the mountainside, hidden by dense trees and jagged rocks. The path was rough and steep, but after some time it began to level out. He followed it for what felt like an hour, the fading light making the journey more treacherous. Finally, after rounding a bend, Cedric saw the outskirts of the city below him. It was a modest settlement nestled between two towering cliffs, hidden from the main road. From this side, he could see the city's central gate far in the distance, where fires burned in braziers and guards patrolled the walls. He smiled to himself. He had managed to bypass the bandits' trap.
I found the city.
He whispered to the sky.
Now what?
The dragon's voice rumbled once more in his mind.
Enter the city and rest for the night. I will search for Thalorax's cave nearby. There are many places he could have hidden. I'll return to you when I have news.
Understood. I'll wait for your word.
With that, Cedric guided his horse down the slope and made his way to the city's rear entrance. The outskirts were quiet, with only a few farmers and traders finishing their work for the day. He passed through the small gate without issue, the guards barely giving him a second glance. It seemed they were more concerned with what lay beyond the main gate than travelers from the wilderness. He led his horse through the narrow cobbled streets, the scent of cooked food and burning wood filling the air. The city was modest but lively, with merchants calling out their wares and people bustling about. Eventually, he found what he was looking for, a large, weathered tavern near the edge of the market square. The sign above the door read, "The Weary Traveler." Tying his horse to a post outside, he entered the tavern, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Inside, the tavern was warm and inviting, filled with the chatter of patrons enjoying a meal and drink after a long day. A roaring fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The knight approached the bar where a stout man with a thick beard was serving drinks.
A room for the night,
he said, sliding a few coins across the counter. The innkeeper nodded, pocketing the coins.
Up the stairs, second door on the left. We serve stew until midnight if you're hungry.
After enjoying a hearty stew for supper, Cedric ascended the stairs to his bedroom and promptly drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the lengthy voyage. As the first rays of the sun crept over the horizon, he stirred in his small room at the inn. His sleep had been light and restless, knowing that the dragon would return soon. Just as the sunlight pierced through the gaps in the shutters, A familiar voice rumbled in his mind, waking him fully.
It's time.
Vorganax's deep voice echoed through the medallion.
Leave the gate you entered through, turn right along the wide path, and head toward the forest. There is a high cliff at the end of the valley. Meet me there.
Cedric quickly rose, strapping on his sword and gathering his gear. He hurried outside to where his horse was still tied, the crisp morning air refreshing but filled with tension. Mounting his horse, he rode through the quiet streets, the townsfolk still asleep or beginning their morning routines. He left through the back gate as instructed, following the path out of the city. The road was rough but wide, winding through the forest and eventually leading him to the base of a high cliff. The knight dismounted, tying his horse to a sturdy tree, and began the steep climb up the cliffside. His hands found purchase on rocks and roots as he ascended, the effort strenuous but manageable. When he finally reached the top, Vorganax was there, perched on the edge of the cliff, his enormous wings folded, his golden eyes watching the valley below. Cedric, catching his breath, approached the dragon.
What's going on?
He asked.
What did you find?
He didn't respond immediately, but instead gestured with his large head toward a neighboring cliff at the end of the valley. The knight stepped closer, narrowing his eyes to see. In the distance, he could just make out a camp nestled against the base of a mountain. Smoke curled into the sky from several fires, and long lines of people, men, women, children, and the elderly, were moving under the harsh gaze of overseers. The people were carrying heavy sacks on their backs, stumbling under the weight. Every now and then, one of the overseers would crack a whip, driving them forward. The workers dumped the contents of their sacks into a large pit, where other figures sifted through the stones, occasionally pulling out glowing objects that caught the sunlight. Precious stones and gold, no doubt. Cedric's expression darkened.
It looks like some kind of mine.
He said quietly.
But those people, they look like slaves.
The dragon nodded solemnly.
They are. This valley is controlled by slavers who exploit these poor souls for the treasures buried in the mountain. This wasn't here when I last visited. Something has changed, and it is not for the better.
The knight clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest.
We need to help them. We cannot simply stand by and do nothing.
The dragon's eyes flickered with a hint of approval.
I agree. Those people are innocent and they deserve to be freed from this torment. But there's more to this than just slavers. The cave you see over there.
He pointed with a massive claw toward the entrance to a large cavern near the camp.
My friend Thalorax once lived there. If he still does, he would not have allowed this to happen. Something must have driven him away, or worse.
Cedric's eyes followed Vorganax's gaze.
So, what's the plan?
The dragon lowered his voice, his tone more strategic now.
You will approach the camp on horseback, pretend to be a lost traveler as you did before, and distract the guards. Meanwhile, I will strike from above. Their archers are positioned on the cliffs surrounding the camp. I'll take them out before they can react.
The knight nodded, his resolve firm.
I can do that, but what about the slaves? Once the guards are dealt with, we need to free them.
Vorganax's eyes gleamed with fire.
Once the archers are gone, the guards will fall quickly. Freeing the slaves will be our priority, but we must also reach the cave. If Thalorax is inside, he may be in danger, or worse, he could be the one who's behind this.
Cedric's eyes widened slightly.
You think your friend could have turned against these people?
I hope not.
Vorganax replied grimly.
But dragons change over time, especially after years of solitude. Power can corrupt even the strongest of minds. We'll only know once we confront him. But first, we deal with the slavers.
The knight took a deep breath, adjusting the medallion around his neck.
All right, let's do this. I'll head down and draw their attention.
The dragon's wings unfurled slightly, a sense of readiness emanating from his massive frame.
Stay sharp, I'll be watching from the skies. When the time comes, strike hard and fast.
With a final nod, the knight turned and made his way back down the cliff to his horse. Mounting up, he rode toward the camp, his heart racing. He could feel Vorganax's presence above him, a silent guardian, as he approached the mine, preparing to set their plan into motion. Sir Cedric rode up to the large wooden gate of the camp, his eyes narrowing as he saw several guards emerging to meet him. They were rough-looking men, the same sort he had seen earlier, hardened by a life of cruelty, likely slavers or bandits. One of them stepped forward, a scarred face and a sneer twisting his lips. It was the same bandit Cedric had met on the mountain road just the day before.
Well, well.
The scarred bandit said with a cruel laugh.
Who that is? Hey there, traveler. I thought we told you to go. How did you end up at our camp? Have you also decided to disappear here?
Cedric's lips curled into a mocking smile, his voice laced with sarcasm.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm just a simple traveler, remember? Lost and looking for a place to rest. I thought this camp would be as good a spot as any.
He cast a glance at the men behind the scarred bandit, his tone turning wry.
I had no idea you ran such a friendly inn.
The bandit's expression darkened and he drew his sword, stepping menacingly toward Cedric.
You think this is a joke? You won't be laughing for long, traveler.
But before he could reach him, chaos erupted from above. Bandits stationed on the cliffs surrounding the camp began to scream as they were knocked from their perches, plummeting to the ground with cries of panic. Confusion spread like wildfire, and the sound of a loud alarm bell clanged from deep within the camp.
What the?
The scarred bandit's words were cut off as he turned toward the cliffs, only to see bodies falling and chaos breaking out across the camp. Suddenly the air was filled with the unmistakable roar of Vorganax. The dragon, massive and powerful, flew out from the cliff above, flames pouring from his mouth as he strafed the camp, burning everything in his path. Screams filled the air as tents and buildings burst into flames and people ran in all directions. The slavers stumbled over each other in their haste to escape the fury of the dragon, and Cedric seized the opportunity. With one swift motion, he swung his shield at the scarred bandit, hitting him square in the head. The man crumpled to the ground unconscious, and he urged his horse forward, galloping into the heart of the camp. Chaos surrounded him. Bandits poured from the huts and buildings, some desperately trying to put out the fires with water from the well, others grabbing weapons to defend themselves. But the dragon's onslaught was relentless. The dragon dove from the sky, his claws raking through the remaining guards on the cliffs, tossing them like rag dolls. His fire burned away the makeshift defenses, turning the camp into an inferno. The knight dismounted and fought his way through the confusion. Slavers came at him from all sides, but he moved with the precision of a seasoned knight, his sword flashing in the morning light. He cut down one slaver after another, dodging blows and scattering his enemies. At times, Vorganax's shadow would fall across him and the dragon would swoop in, knocking bandits from their feet or incinerating them with a blast of flame. Realizing they were no match for the combined strength of the knight and the dragon, The last of the slavers tried to escape. They split off in separate directions, but Vorganax surged once again, his flames engulfing the surviving stragglers. The fire destroyed most of the bandits, the boom of the flames muffled their shouts. The handful that made it survive disappeared into the forest. When it was all over, Cedric stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving from the exertion. The dragon landed nearby with a thunderous thud, folding his wings as he surveyed the destruction they had wrought. The knight raised his voice, calling out to the terrified people still hiding in the camp.
It's over. You're free now. Come out. There's nothing more to fear.
Slowly, the surviving workers and villagers emerged from their hiding places. Their faces were filled with relief and disbelief, and they began to gather around Cedric, some of them weeping with gratitude. An older man, his face weathered with age, approached and bowed deeply.
"Thank you, sir,"
the man said, his voice choked with emotion.
"You've saved us. We thought we'd be worked to death here."
Cedric nodded, grateful for their safety.
I did what I could. But tell me, this cave, there was once a dragon who lived here. Have any of you seen him?
The villagers exchanged uneasy glances before the old man answered.
"That dragon, it's been dead for years now, killed by the slavers who first took over this place. Its bones, they lie in the cave, a grim reminder of what happened here."
Cedric's heart sank as he turned to look at his friend. The dragon's eyes, normally fierce and bright, were now clouded with sorrow.
Thalorax.
Vorganax whispered, the weight of the loss clear in his voice. The villagers led them to the entrance of the cave, where the air was cool and damp. Inside, dim light filtered through cracks in the stone, illuminating the skeletal remains of a once great dragon. The bones lay sprawled across the floor of the cavern, enormous and weathered by time. The dragon approached the remains, his head bowed in silent grief.
Forgive me, my friend,
Cedric said quietly, placing a hand on Vorganax's scaly hide.
He must have been a great dragon.
Vorganax's voice was quiet, filled with regret.
He was. We flew together long ago before the wars began, and now he is gone, like so many others.
The knight nodded, giving Vorganax a moment of silence before speaking again.
But there are more dragons, are there not? Others like you?
The dragon raised his head, his sadness giving way to determination.
Yes, there are others, and we will find them. Thalorax's fate will not have been in vain.
Well then,
Cedric said, sheathing his sword.
Our journey continues.
With one last glance at the remains of the fallen dragon, they left the cave. The knight mounted his horse and they headed towards the horizon again. Their journey was far from over, and new dangers awaited them. But together they would face whatever came next, for they were bound together by a mission that had only just begun.